Welcome to Cambridge Forum with author Lawrence Bergreen discussing his book Marco Polo. I'm Eugenio Menegon, assistant professor of Chinese history at Boston University, and I am also a native, I happen to be a native of the region of Venice, and I studied Chinese language and literature at the University of Venice. So I'm particularly pleased to be here to talk about another Venetian in China. In summer 2008, the world will visit China as Beijing hosts the Summer Olympic Games. What will the Western public see? And how will we understand it? In his new book, Marco Polo, author Lawrence Bergreen looks back at one of the best documented early journeys from the West to China to retell the well-known story of a callow youth of 17 traveling with his father and uncle to Asia in 1271. There, he lived in the court of Kublai Khan for 24 years, eventually returning to Venice with knowledge of the latest inventions, with great stories, and with wealth. What were the personal qualities that made Marco Polo the earliest bridge between East and West? How did Marco Polo break language and cultural barriers to become a trusted advisor to the highest levels of Chinese government under Mongol rule? How did his book, The Travels, recorded by a fellow prisoner in the Genoese jail, come to have such a big impact on future historians and travelers? A graduate of Harvard University, Lawrence Bergreen is the author of many acclaimed biographies and histories, including the most recent, Over the Edge of the World, Magellan's terrifying circumnavigation of the globe. He has also written biographies of James Agee, Louis Armstrong, Al Capone, and Irving Berlin, each considered definitive. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Larry Bergreen.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's great to see you. I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate your taking a little time out from the excitement of the World Series. We're going to talk a little bit about Marco Polo tonight, and although this is a book which takes place mostly in the 13th century, the deeper I got into it during my own 4-year journey in search of Marco Polo and his travels, the more it seemed to me that this was, in an oblique way, really a book about today, and Marco Polo's world, although it seems so far away and so removed from us in time and in language and custom, by the end it seemed to me was not really that different, and I'm going to try and explain to you why, and that I think we can find keys to many global problems and conundrums that we're facing in this very, very complex and many-chambered book. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to read his travels and just picked up the Penguin edition or some others, but if you have, you've probably had the experience of finding this a very, very confusing book, although it seems to be simple. It is a many-chambered book with a complicated history. It has been scrambled and re-scrambled over the centuries. I liken it to a manuscript that's been dropped down a flight of stairs and then gathered up, and there are sections that are in the right order, but other sections that are not in the right order. I've tried to do what I can in various places to unscramble parts of it and make it comprehensible and relevant for a modern audience. After I finished the Magellan book, I was about the first circumnavigation, I went back to the person who inspired him, and a copy of whose work Magellan and many of the sailors brought along with them, both as entertainment and inspiration, and that was Marco Polo, whose travels were among the most popular books in Europe at that time. But people weren't sure really until the 19th century about much of what Marco Polo said, whether was it fact or was it fiction. In fact, he was taken to be a fabulist, and that was a popular travel genre at the time he wrote, and it was assumed that Marco Polo, and partly because of his embellishments and partly because of people's expectations, was doing the same thing. In fact, he was writing a travelogue, a sort of a supercharged travelogue. Now, his voyage, his travels took 24 years, and I have about 10 minutes left to cover all that ground. But I'll try and explain a little bit that some of you might know about his travels, but may be fresh to some others of you. As the professor mentioned, Marco Polo actually didn't write these travels. He dictated them to a ghostwriter named Rustichello, who came from Pisa, who had been a favorite writer of King Edward I of England, who was no literary critic. Rustichello was a romance writer, manqué, and he wrote as Marco Polo dictated to him when they were both in a jail in Genoa. Actually, it was really a palazzo, and they were kept there as captives over a period of perhaps a year. And then afterwards, Marco Polo we think, made changes and corrections and additions to this manuscript. Keep in mind, this was before the invention of movable type in Western Europe, so manuscripts were the only way to go. Rustichello wrote in French, which was the language of much learned discourse at that time. There was Latin for the clergy, otherwise it was French, and his French wasn't that good. It was filled with all sorts of words from local dialects. He had as difficult a time with French tenses as I do, and he often switched 2 or 3 times in the course of a single sentence. And on top of all that, there are dozens of Marco Polo manuscripts, early ones, maybe as many as 100, and yet there's no one authentic original manuscript. And they're drastically different from one another, not just in language, not just because one's in Gaelic and one's in Tuscan and one's in French and others in Latin. Some are twice as long as others, and some tell very different stories from others. Also, Rustichello, and I can understand this, being a writer, had an itch to put himself in the story. So what he did was take old battle scenes of his, stock pieces, and stick them like cherries or raisins in a roll to sort of spice up Marco's stories. Now, they do stick out, and it's very easy to tell these two apart, but as terms of collaborators, Woodward and Bernstein, they were not. And so the result is a fascinating, lumpy, and uneven concoction that scholars ever since have been trying to sort out. Now, there's actually, despite the fact that Marco Polo was so famous, very little about him in English. I discovered just one book about him, a brief one published in the 70s, really more about the times and the life, a bit more in other languages, virtually nothing in China until very, very recently. And they're just beginning to know and adopt Marco Polo as some sort of a national figure now in China. So his reputation has always been a very, very curious one. There is a trove of scholarship about Marco Polo and another trove of children's books about Marco Polo, but very little for that we would consider to be mainstream history. And there are a lot of myths about Marco Polo. For example, nothing to do with pasta or macaroni, had nothing to do with that at all. And there are also theories that he didn't go to China, that he fabricated it all, that he was a woman, that he was 2 people. And in fact, he really did go, and he really did write his travels with Rustichello, but because it's the 13th century, we really don't know all the specifics. But there are variant traditions revolving around Marco Polo that anybody who ventures into this field has to take into account. Unlike our idea of an explorer, he did not decide to go explore China. And I don't know how many times I read that Marco Polo discovered China. He was one of many, countless merchants from not only all over Europe, but all over what we now call the Middle East, who were taking some branch of what we now call the Silk Road, some trail, into Asia to trade with the Mongols. The Mongols, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, who was the grandfather of Kublai Khan, had conquered China and made it safe, made the Silk Road safe for travel, and Kublai Khan invited Westerners like the Polos in, allowed them to trade, but wanted them to administer his huge, far-flung empire. The Mongols were wonderful warriors, and they were fabulous on horseback. They were able to ride a horse at a full gallop, facing backward, and fire arrows one after another against their enemies. And they were able to conquer all of Asia and a good part of Europe, all the way to the banks of the Danube River. It was thought at that time that they would keep going, but they stopped there. So Kublai Khan, as a result, wound up becoming the emperor of a loose federation that was the largest land-based empire in history. Yet there weren't enough people to administer it, which is why Europeans like the Polos, or many Arabs as well, came in handy as tax collectors, particularly, and just sort of eyes and ears, spies, if you will, for Kublai Khan. Marco's father and uncle, Niccolo and Maffeo, had gone on a trip before him and had met Kublai Khan, and he gave them an order to come back to the capital city, which is in the location of Beijing now, but was called Kambulak, with 100 wise men from Europe. He basically wanted to pick their brains for science, for any kind of knowledge, for military knowledge, natural sciences, anything you could imagine. Well, they agreed to do that just so they could leave, but of course they had no idea how to do that. Instead, they brought back their one son, Marco, who was only 17 at the time. Now, they had been gone for 16 years when they returned to Venice from their first trip without him. So he was virtually a stranger to them, and vice versa. And after a brief time in Venice, they brought him along, this son who really didn't know who they were, on the second trip to Kublai Khan. It's the second trip, which is the one that was immortalized in the book, and the one that Marco, much later, in prison, wrote about. But he went as a kid, and he went because his uncle and father dragged him there. Otherwise, he would have spent his life in some part of Venice, and as a merchant of Venice, which is what he eventually became when he returned. However, this proved to be the most extraordinary education experience that anybody ever had, and Marco Polo came of age on the Silk Road with all its hardships and all its rigors. Travel at that time was agonizingly slow. You either went on foot or on horseback or by donkey cart. Occasionally you sailed, but that was extraordinarily dangerous, and people avoided the water at all cost. Boats were very unsafe, and Marco had some near brushes himself on the way home. So it was considered safer to go over land, but it took years, at least 3 years, but sometimes 4 or 5 years, to get all the way from Venice to Beijing or Kambulak. So it was a very, very serious undertaking to do this. Why did people go? They went to get rich. They went because Kublai Khan let them trade on the side, and as soon as they hit Afghanistan, they could begin trading in rubies and other precious stones, and later on in spices and silk and other fabrics. There were an endless number of things to be traded in, and skilled merchants like the Polos, Marco and his father and uncle, well, Marco gradually learned how to become one himself, could enrich themselves along the way, and eventually they transferred their wealth into the form of gems, which they could sew into their garments, and so that was a portable form of wealth, because of course there was no such thing as a bank that they could deal with at that time. Marco, if you read his book as a merchant's view of Asia at that time, it's a way to understand it, because although he missed many things which seem so vitally important to us, for example, printing in China, not to mention all sorts of scientific and astronomical developments, and cultural and literary things, completely went over his head. As a merchant, he did understand fabrics and gems and other items, pelts and skins and tusks that people traded in on the Silk Road. So he had his own particular perspective. It was not particularly an intellectual one, and he was also, because he was a young man, fascinated by the women and marital customs of the various areas that he went through. One of his most widely disbelieved, and I'm going to wrap it up in a second, one of his most widely disbelieved stories was going through remote towns in what would now be one of the stands, we're not exactly sure which, where the husbands would invite travelers such as the Polos to stay as their guests, which was fine, and not only that, but to stay with their wives, and they would then leave them alone with their wives for several days. And Marco found this astounding, but wrote about this custom in considerable detail. This was the kind of tall tale and bawdy tale that was disbelieved for centuries in his book. However, in the 19th century, when anthropologists and others came into China, they discovered that what Marco Polo wrote wasn't fantasy, it was largely fact, including customs like that. And one can speculate that the reason was that these very isolated towns were suffering from a depleted gene pool and had evolved an adaptation to refresh the gene pool, which was to entice travelers, the few travelers who did come through, to come in and contribute some genetic material to this depleted gene pool. Marco had other customs that even he was astounded by, that he couldn't explain. For example, the Mongols, who believed, they worshipped heaven. It's a complicated subject, but they were heaven worshippers in a nutshell. For them, the afterlife was very important. They had a custom of marrying dead children between two families and betrothing them as if they were still alive, and this was an arranged marriage. And they concocted entire family lives in genealogies for these dead children as if they were still alive. Because in the Mongols' minds, some part of them, in their spirit, still was alive. And they even had elaborate wedding ceremonies for these dead children, with big feasting, as if they were alive. Marco could not believe what he was seeing, and when people read his account years later, they could not believe what they were reading. And yet, as ethnologists and anthropologists and travelers closer to the modern era discovered, it was all true. And those customs, or remnants of those customs, were still going on at the time that Marco, at the time they were there, 100 centuries after Marco. So the value of his book is really a record of a period in history which was in many ways far advanced over Europe, which was tumultuous, which represented an interpenetration of Western and Mongol and Chinese cultures all at once. And he was there to write it down, plus to give a personal fly-on-the-wall view of the most powerful ruler in history, who was Kublai Khan, which is what makes his book so fascinating, what I think makes many of the scholarly and linguistic problems as unresolvable as many of them are worth dealing with. You may just briefly, I'll tell you very briefly why he wound up in jail. He got back to Venice when he was 41, and after a while he got bored. He didn't get married right away, as was expected of him. One could surmise that he had had a lot of adventures in Europe, and the strictures of a conventional marriage in Venice was not to his liking. He went off to war. There was a constant battle between Venice and its rival city-state, Genoa, as a commander, and he was captured by the Genoese, and that's how he happened to be placed in a jail, really a kind of house arrest when he got to Genoa, and happened to be placed with Rustichello, who wrote down his account because he had made a large impression on people by telling his stories. Now, if not for this quirk of fate, nobody would have remembered Marco Polo. For example, his father and uncle made 2 trips all the way to China and Khambulak, and we know almost nothing about them because they didn't write down their accounts. As the professor mentioned, other people have also written accounts. Marco is the best known and the most flamboyant in the West. But in the Muslim world, Ibn Battuta wrote a very similar account of his travels 30 or 40 years later. And he went to many of the same places, cities and towns that Marco did, and you can compare and contrast how they were doing when he got there a generation later. Was there a boom? Was there a bust? There was even a Marco Polo in reverse named Rabban Soma, who was a Nestorian Christian monk who went from Manchuria along the Silk Road to Paris and to Rome. At the same time, Marco Polo was heading east. And he also wrote an account of his experiences. So there are actually many Marco Polos out there from different backgrounds and persuasions, all giving their impressions of what was actually a very exciting and tumultuous time in history. So anyway, I'll open it up to questions and discussions.
Thank you very much for your words.
Thank you.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Lauren Bergreen discussing his book, Marco Polo. And I will start with a broad question before we open the floor to further questions for our author. In the opening pages of your book, you describe the world of 13th century Venetians as startlingly modern.
Yes.
And you use the word globally connected across boundaries and borders, both natural and artificial. You also say that Venetian trade was synonymous with globalization, and again, you say another embryonic concept of the era. So when it comes to assess the personality of Marco Polo, however, you also tell us that his world was enchanted, a place where lands teem with Amazons and dragons, spirits and demons. So can you tell us how you see converging in Marco Polo elements that you find at the same time contemporary, modern, and global, with a vision typical of the medieval world?
You know, he was really a late medieval figure. So when we think of the Middle Ages, Marco Polo actually comes a little bit later than that. And Venice was so highly advanced and had, in order to survive and prosper as such a small place, had developed so many business practices that made it possible for them to trade around the world, to engage in military conflict to protect their commercial interests. They really practiced a form of early capitalism and the way the Republic financed voyages. The concept of capitalism didn't exist, of course, at the time, but looking back now, we see that it was a precursor. Ships were made in a precursor of a modern factory in the arsenal in Venice, which was the original arsenal. The name, like many words in Veneto, was borrowed from the Arabic, was able to turn out a galley every 15 or 20 minutes. In my book, I quote an observer who saw this astonishing sight, and it was something that reminds you of a modern production line, and they had practiced many of the same principles of standardizing all the elements of a ship and cutting it down to the essentials and assembling it very quickly and replicating, standardizing the same ship over and over again. So in some ways, the business and commercial practices of Venice were very modern. In other ways, in other cultural ways, they really look back, really as far back to the Roman Empire, because of course, as you know, the Venetian system of the Doge was modeled on the idea of a Latin leader, a Roman leader, a dux, and he considered himself, he was a kind of a reclusive figure who was both a political and spiritual leader. There was an oligarchy that ruled the city of just a few hundred families. The Polos were not even really in that very small upper echelon. They didn't quite rate that high. Marco likes to call himself a noble at a number of points, but it's not really clear if his fellow Venetians would have regarded him as a nobleman. Maybe some would have, and maybe some wouldn't have. Anywhere, the Polos didn't really come in that high in the Venetian hierarchy, but it was really a remarkably structured and sophisticated society that managed to defend itself against not only rival city-states, but also many challenges from as far away as Rome. Even though Venice, the Church of Rome was, of course, the official Church of Venice, often Venice defied Rome and suffered the consequences as well. So there was also really a defiant spirit to Venice, which gave it its particular character and mystique. You know, that doesn't mean that Marco necessarily embodied all that. One of the things that I found that came through in his travels, as one gets familiar with it over many, many readings, was his sense of charm and his gregariousness, which made his entire career and his travels possible. And the way that he gradually took on other cultures, almost in a chameleon-like fashion, because after all, he left home at a relatively young age when he was 17. And later on, I think it's fair to say, for a while anyway, he worshipped Mongols. He was very excited by them. And, you know, the Mongols are in some ways similar to American Indians. They're similar genetically, they're similar ethnographically, they're nomads and they're warriors. And one could almost make an analogy to a settler being kidnapped by the Indians and then growing up with the Indians and identifying with the Indians. Marco Polo also wound up identifying with the Mongol nation. But the Mongols were in transition at that time as well, because Genghis Khan, of course, was the great conqueror, but Kublai Khan wanted to be the universal emperor, as you know, and he wanted to rule the entire known world. And he wanted to consolidate all cultures somehow under his rather vague aegis, starting with China. Now, these were two very, very opposed cultures, and he was trying to yoke together, in some ways, cultures that were diametrically opposites. A nomadic culture and a pastoral culture, just tremendously different. So it was not ultimately a successful experiment, but it was a remarkable experiment. But as you can see, as Marco gets a little bit older and travels into the hinterlands and sees some of the results of the Mongol conquest, the destroyed cities, that he becomes disenchanted with some of the warlike, especially the earlier aspects of Mongol culture, which were so destructive and so warlike, because when the Mongols took a city, they razed it. They killed everything in the city. That meant children, that meant animals, that meant anything that grew. Nothing was left alive. And Marco was understandably very horrified this as he got to be older. In place of worshiping the Mongols, if you will, he then became more and more fascinated by Buddhism, which was an alien concept in Venice. At first, he dismissed it as idolatry. That was the word he used. But later on, wound up comparing Buddha to the Apostle Thomas. There was the original Doubting Thomas. And identified in some way with both of these figures who shed light on his journey. Now, it seemed to me that as Marco spent so many years on the road and suffered some of the isolation and alienation and deprivation of those years on the road, that Buddhism spoke to his condition, and it became a more and more meaningful view to him. And that doesn't mean that when he got back to Venice, he considered himself a Buddhist. Quite the opposite. As you know, he completely forgot about all that. After he was freed from jail and after he wrote collaborated with Rustichello, he did get married and lived a very, proper and conventional Venetian life.
So if I can follow up with another question, then
Sure.
You are also the author of a biography of Magellan.
Yes.
How would you compare the two in terms of this view of modernity, of globalization?
Magellan was a much more difficult, tragic figure. He fits our idea of a modern explorer because he had a goal. He was going to circumnavigate the globe. He was going to find a shortcut to bring spices back. He was going to give Spain, for which he sailed, even though he was Portuguese, a tremendous commercial advantage. So he was, we can understand that because he was very goal-directed. Marco Polo was, in his medieval way, was perhaps more of an existentialist. And he was certainly much more of like an open system. And he took things as they came, and he did not make things happen. Magellan made things happen and paid for it with his life, because he eventually got involved in an unnecessary war in the Philippines with some indigenous peoples there, and they killed him. Nothing. Marco never killed anybody, but did find ways to ingratiate himself wherever he went, partly but through the language of commerce, because he found that was a universal language, and wherever he went, people, no matter how warlike, no matter how belligerent they were, wanted to trade, needed to trade. They were fascinated by whatever they could buy. Partly it was the novelty, partly it was just getting a hold of things that they needed. For example, salt, which was an intensely traded substance and really became like money. The same with silk. Another very, very important thing that became virtually currency, as well as all the other more conventional uses that we think of it. So in a sense, for him, the universal language as a merchant was commerce. I think there's a lesson in that for today.
Thank you. So welcome again to Cambridge Forum with author Lawrence Bergreen as we continue our discussion of his book Marco Polo and the ways this 13th century Venetian traveler forever altered the European view of the world. At this point in the program, we'll take questions from the audience. Please line up at the microphone and be brief. And I encourage you to come if you have questions, please. Thank you.
Hello. I was wondering if you could speak a little longer about the controversy about whether Marco Polo did go to China or not. I know Francis Wood is probably the biggest proponent of this.
Right.
And I found that European historians sort of universally come down on the side of, oh yes, he definitely went. And Chinese historians seem to be unanimous in saying, oh no, he didn't. We have the records. His name doesn't show up in the administration. And I was wondering if you could talk about not only your own personal perspective on what might objectively be true, but why that question matters to us so much and why it comes down and why the lines are drawn in those ways. Sort of, it seems to matter what culture you are approaching the story from, what truth you wind up with.
Yeah, actually, the Chinese think he did go also, but it's a very good question because it shines so much light on the background. He wrote at a time when many travel stories, especially the one by Sir John Mandeville, were bogus, and people would claim to have traveled all over Asia, China, wherever they went, and they just went to a library and they put together tales from antiquity, and that would be the equivalent of just copying and pasting stuff from the internet and putting it together in a very, very long essay and saying that you went to these places and you did these things. So it was natural for people to assume that Marco Polo, with his fantastic tales, was doing very much the same thing. Also, there was very little way to verify until the 19th century what he was writing about. As I said earlier, a lot of it struck people as being incredible, and so they thought that he had a very good imagination. Even the things that he brought back with him from China, such as coal and paper money and gunpowder and scientific instruments, did not register with the Venetians because they couldn't see a use for it. For example, coal, you would think, well, who couldn't understand that? But at that time in Western Europe, they were using peat and wood for fuel, not coal. Coal came later on. So the inventions that he brought back, although, well, many other people were bringing them back as well, actually didn't transfer easily to Western Europe. They had to be invented all over again. The printing press being the best example. Gutenberg invented the printing press several hundred years after the Chinese had printing. Now, it was not the same kind of printing because there's too many Chinese characters. The Chinese printing was more like stencils or blocks. Nevertheless, it was, fits our definition of printing. In the 19th century, when other people got into China, they realized that a lot of what Marco Polo said made sense. But there was still a persistent kind of contra-tradition that Marco Polo didn't go and that he had borrowed from other travelers or debriefed other travelers to compile his account, or only got as far as Constantinople or something like that. Anyway, didn't do the kinds of things that he said he did. He got some extra help inadvertently from his collaborator, Rustichello, who was only too happy to embellish. So if you were looking for things that, were not true, they tended to be the interpolations from Rustichello. But then several things occurred in more modern scholarship. There was a Chinese scholar who died recently named Wan Chi-chu, who discovered some Chinese annals that tallied exactly with some elements of Marco Polo's story. And although he didn't name the Polos, it described it with such specificity what these three Europeans did and their missions that it could only be Marco Polo. Furthermore, the leading antagonist, if you will, Frances Woods, her arguments have been debunked by a lot of scholars. For example, to just take the most obvious one, how could Marco Polo have gone to China and not written about the Great Wall of China? But the answer is quite simple. It hadn't been built yet. It was built in the Ming Dynasty. But the same thing goes for tea. How could he have gone to China and not mention tea? But he did. In some of the manuscripts, he writes about tea. So I could go on, point by point, but you sort of get the general drift. Yes. Are you bringing things to a conclusion?
No, I'm asking
you
you a
a
question.
question.
Since we're talking about travel and
Yes.
writing about travel, you traveled to write
Yes.
this book. You
Yes.
retraced Marco Polo's route. Will you talk about that? Did you walk and take donkey carts in 3 years? Or how did you travel, and what did you learn by retracing that route?
This subject is so vast that one can easily spend 24 years like Marco trying to retrace his steps. But in my own case, because I was trying to do this book in a reasonable amount of time and keep it a reasonable length, because it could have been several times this length, I made one trip to China, going back and forth across the length of China, which was a fairly extensive trip, then another trip across back and forth Mongolia, and then another trip to Venice for more research there, and then the other trips, which were just as important, were trips to the library. That would be the East Asian Library here, the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, Butler Library, Columbia University, and other specialized or semi-specialized collections around. And what I did on some of these trips, some of it was sightseeing, simply seeing sites that Marco Polo described. It's kind of a now and then comparison, and often being struck by the similarities. Sometimes it was meeting scholars who really don't have much of a voice in the West, so I was able to meet scholars in Beijing and in Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital of Mongolia, and talk with them about their Marco Polo perspectives. If anything, they're even more, they not only believe that Marco Polo was there, they sort of need Marco Polo as a symbol to be there to validate that part of the world in the eyes of the West. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. In the past few years, the Chinese government has endorsed Marco Polo as an important figure, and they've begun erecting big statues of him. And there's a very prominent one that I visited in Hangzhou, which was at one point the capital of the Sung Dynasty in China. And it's new, and it's very striking to have a statue of a foreigner in a location like that. It's almost like having a statue of a foreigner in the Washington Mall. It would, there would be a very good reason for that statue to be there. So I think the Chinese at this point would like to promote the idea that Marco Polo went to China and spoke well of China, but there's a certain irony there because Marco Polo didn't know that much about China. China was strange to him. He didn't speak Chinese, and he was with the Mongols. He was with the occupying army of the Mongols, and it was the Mongols with whom he felt affinity, and with whom he worked, and to whom he had his main affiliation. And if you read carefully his writings about the so-called City of Heaven, which is our modern-day Hangzhou, it often baffled him. And he wrote about it, but it was as he was suddenly stepping out and writing as a stranger, as an outsider, rather than someone who, with the Mongols, he felt a sense of connection. I think that had come to him through his father and uncle, and also through the fact that he was a personal envoy of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan. So his shifting perspectives are very interesting to see. And it's often hard to detect this in modern translations because they tend to be several generations removed from his early manuscripts, and they remove many of the nuances, and they also remove his sense of irony, which was very highly developed, and his bawdy jokes, which I happen to have a personal weakness for. And they also get kind of sanitized out of these increasingly sober, literal translations. And we lose these shifts in tone that help make Marco a kind of a three-dimensional speaker rather than somebody who speaks in a monotone like a narrator. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay. I happen to be a Mongolian. I'm from Inner Mongolia, grassland.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I do have a question that is, your book is a ethnographical or just to do some comment about Marco Polo's travel to China, because you have just mentioned that the Mongols just, totally destroyed the city when they conquered the city.
Yeah.
And kill everybody. Because as far as I know, there's only one city that the Mongol people, killed and totally destroyed the city. That is called Huala Zimo, which is not very far from Turkey.
Right.
And because Genghis Khan at that time sent for a delegate to trying to say that they want to make peace with the people, but the people in the city just killed the delegate because which really annoyed him, and that he totally destroyed the city. And that is only one exception. And another one that is, you have just mentioned that at that time the Great Wall was not actually built, but as far as I know, the Great Wall was not built at that time. But as far as I know, the Great Wall was started building, that is in 222 BC. That was when Emperor Qin Shi Huang just united the central part of Chinese city. So my question is, you are just doing some ethnographical writing, or just to give some comment about Marco Polo's travel, or you're just going, you were actually just trying to testify whether some events are true and someone are not?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, no, let me give you a more complicated answer to that. As Marco went out into the hinterlands, he saw various areas, which he writes about, where he had seen some of the results of the Mongol conquest, and he was very disturbed by it. Now, this was not happening in his time. This went back 2 generations to Genghis Khan. Kublai Khan had set China and the Mongol nation on a different course. He was not sending out, he was not conquering in the same way, although he tried to. He tried unsuccessfully to conquer Japan a number of times. These were major naval battles that turned out to be fiascos for the Yuan dynasty, for Kublai Khan's dynasty, and helped to really end his life and end his reign. They took place towards the end of his life. So he was still looking for new worlds to conquer, but in a different way. But it was certainly a different. It was really different from the way things had been during Genghis Khan's era. So my purpose in writing the book, which you asked me several times, was to try and make a book which is very difficult for contemporary readers in many ways, comprehensible and relevant. There are many questions that it's just very difficult, if not impossible, to answer, because so many of the events took place 600 or 700 years ago, and we don't have enough documents to really describe or figure out what happened. Sometimes even 100 years ago, we don't have enough to figure out what happened, or there are competing versions, depending whom you ask about what happened. In a sense, this is a foray into trying to understand and update Marco Polo. A lot of it was just putting it in order. As I'd mentioned, that image of the manuscript being dropped down the stairs, I spent a lot of time simply trying to figure out what events he was talking about. It was not often clear. And when they occurred, to figure out a chronology, because the chronology of his book is scrambled. For those of you who haven't read it, it's not a chronological story like Tuesday we were in Beijing and then we headed off to Hangzhou and then we went off to the small village. He talks thematically about different areas, combining impressions of several visits over a period of years. So it's more like a guidebook to various areas of Asia. And some of those impressions are quick anecdotes, but some of the results of many visits and a great deal of thought. And he shifts back and forth. And then you have this extra layer of complication with Rustichello, sometimes adding his own bogus elements which need to be filtered out. So that's why it's in some ways a complicated and difficult work to understand, and requires some, some explanation and commentary.
Thanks. Sort of a follow-up on the previous question, in a way. How did he, if at all, differentiate between the Chinese and the Mongols?
How did he,
if at all, differentiate between
how did Marco Polo differentiate?
Yeah.
Well, the only time he spent a great deal of time among Chinese was when he was in Hangzhou, which was a Song Dynasty capital. When it was occupied by the Mongols, he came in with them and was some kind of a functionary or perhaps a tax collector. There was a big controversy because in some translations of his travels, he claims he was placed as the governor of this city, which would have been a very, very eminent position. But in other translations, there's nothing like that. So it's hard to know where this very dramatic statement came. And at any rate, he was there for a few years, and we don't know why he left. But he, as I mentioned earlier, he never really got into the infrastructure of Hangzhou in the way that he was able to in Mongol society. That was partly a reflection of these two very different cultures. Mongol culture was porous, and it was open to outsiders, like the Marco Polo and many others. The far more highly evolved Chinese society was more difficult for someone like Marco to come to grips with, and he passed over, in a way, many of the cultural glories of Hangzhou during his time there. It would seem to a modern reader almost had blinders on, but in fact he was just approaching it from his own perspective.
So if there another question, please.
For Marco Polo, how much do we learn about the capital, Kamulak, and life there? And is it possible to use archaeological findings to confirm what he describes?
Yeah. We actually know a lot from other travelers who also went to Kambalak. Some of them were merchants, some of them were missionaries, and they went either before him or they went shortly after, and they wrote accounts that were not quite as exciting or vivid as Marco Polo's, but they tell the same story, and they have many of the same cast of characters, and they all they have their different perspectives. Obviously, a missionary is going to, be writing about his opportunities for conversions and will not dwell in the same way and sort of bawdy way that Marco Polo did on the customs, the marital customs and courtship customs that he discovered in various cities. But there are actually, well, I would think perhaps 10 texts, all from very different sources. I had mentioned Rabban Salma earlier as just one of them, who cover many of the same places and people and things that Marco wrote about. Now, there are some that are unique to Marco, which come out of his experience. This mission that he went on to escort a Mongol princess, which is sort of his, well, the Chinese scholars claim to think actually pinning Marco Polo and his father and uncle in China shortly before their departure. You wouldn't find anywhere else because it was an experience that was unique to them, and people weren't really able to share their information in a way that we take for granted because of not only the distance problem, but the language problem. Many of these documents were written in different languages, which, people that were not able to understand. And it wasn't until the 18th century that many of them were translated into a tongue that was widely read. So it remained, their accounts remained confined to their, particular culture or area. Yeah.
I believe you started saying that there were many parallels to today and his travels. I wondered if you wanted to say more about that.
Well, this is sort of in the eye of the beholder and what you make of it, but it seemed to me that he discovered some universals of human interaction. The fact that commerce seemed to cut across all political boundaries. The fact that the biggest boundaries that he encountered really were not geographical or even political so much as matters of faith, that these seem to be the kind of, arbitrary and unchangeable lines that that he was dealing with. As a person of, I wouldn't say no faith, but changeable faith, Marco was able in his chameleon-like way to fit into some of these different areas, at least temporarily, but it was certainly something that was very reminiscent of what's going on today. When he talks about Afghanistan and how dangerous it is, and all the highwaymen, and the fact that it was the poppy growing center of the world, and there are lots of rubies there. This is all Afghanistan today. Very little has changed, and you can find people who live pretty much the same way. So it's not just that he was looking forward, although he did that in some ways. He was also looking backward, and to examples of people living in more primitive ways or simpler ways. In Mongolia today, it's not that hard to go out of Ulaanbaatar and find yourself, as I did, staying in a Gur camp and seeing sites that he described and being transported into a very different world from what we think of as the present. But after a while, you start thinking, well, what is the present anyway? The present is where you happen to be. So, that's why I think his book is so unbelievably rich, because it's almost like tree rings, or a layer of the earth with different geological sections that are still in his book. They're interacting. They're not inert, and that gives it a lot of confusion, but a lot of energy.
How did Marco Polo and his fellow travelers navigate their way along these Silk Roads? I mean, how did they know which way to go? Were there maps in his day? Did they rely on local geographers or the traffic along the Silk Roads to get local directions? Mm-hmm. And following on that, how soon after Marco Polo wrote his account did his accounts begin to show up in maps? And did he influence cartographers? I noticed that you include a reproduction of a 15th century world map in your book. Yeah,
those are both, to begin with, how did they navigate or get around? They had sort of two competing views of the world. One was the macro, which was based on a literal or biblical interpretation of the world from the Bible, which was not only useless, but very dangerous, because you could wind up going off into nowhere. But then the other approach was from other travelers who would tell you how to get from point A to point B. Travel along the Silk Road had become fairly organized by Marco Polo's time, thanks to the Mongols, who had made it safe for the first time in centuries. And so along the way there were stations. They were sort of the medieval equivalents of motels. These were stations where you could stop over, tie up your cattle and your beasts downstairs, and then go to a simple sleeping quarters upstairs and spend the night. They were often at oasis. There was water there, and then you would pick up information from other merchants about the next way to go. The Silk Road wasn't often that clearly marked, but these various routes, people traveled in large caravans rather than together, rather than separately, and so they tended not to get lost, except in certain areas that Marco Polo wrote about, particularly when he wrote about the singing sands and some other areas where it was very easy to become disoriented and lost. So I would say that was a bit more like getting around the city in a subway, but not really knowing the layout of the city. But if you knew how the subway worked, you could find your way from point A to point B and to point C in the city, and you would be able to get to where you needed to go.
It's my impression, and I'm probably wrong, that the world that Marco Polo didn't change very much for hundreds and hundreds of years, almost up to the present time, all the way across his travels compared to the West, to Europe. If I'm right, how do you perceive this reason for the changes in the Western world compared to the Mohammedan world or the Chinese world? Or am I wrong in this interpretation of relatively slow rates of change and retention of ancient cultures in those parts of the world?
Some of it had to do with the Silk Road and the exchange of culture and commerce that was taking place. And a lot of it is really just an entirely separate work. I think it's far more speculative. I was really trying to explore what Marco Polo himself encountered, and some of it had to do with evolving political systems, some of it had to do with climate, and one of the big changes, of course, was that the Mongol Empire, which seemed to Marco Polo to be a permanent feature now that it had become established, didn't actually last very long. And he actually saw it near the beginning of the end, and he would have been astonished to discover that the Mongol Empire hadn't survived very long, and his own work did. When Christopher Columbus, not long after Marco Polo, set out to try and discover China, for some reason he thought he was going to meet Kublai Khan when he got there. And of course, not only was Kublai Khan long gone, but the Mongol Empire was long gone. So, you know, so that's a question that, you know, one could spend a lot of time on, but it's easier to address in specifics about why certain things happen than overall. When it gets, the number of variables is just overwhelming. Yes?
What do we know about the Polo family's method of communication? That is, did the people they meet along the road speak Latin, French? You said they didn't know Chinese. Yeah. How did they communicate on the road and then when they arrived in China?
Marco Polo said he spoke 4 languages, and so he probably spoke some different Mongol dialects. Of course, he spoke Veneto, and he did not know Chinese, and he might have picked up some other languages along the way that were useful for trading, especially Persian. So he talks about the fact that his father and uncle did, and that was very helpful. But we don't often know exactly what languages were used. We do know it was a problem because Kublai Khan was trying to find, in part of his quest to be universal emperor, a universal language that could be used, official language anyway, could be used throughout his vast empire. This proved to be a fascinating but futile undertaking. So, you know, it's a really good question, and it's just difficult to know. But anyway, that's a sort of a partial answer, I guess, to it.
So if there are no longer questions, I'd like to ask a final wrap-up question. Yes. There was a thread, I think, in many of the questions tonight, asking about Marco Polo's relevance to today's world, yes, and asking also about Marco Polo as a mythical figure. You yourself have seen the statue of Marco Polo in Hangzhou, yes, and you have commented that the Chinese probably are putting that statue out today because he represents commercial connections with the rest of the world, and that's what China is all about today, capitalist development. Yes, yes. We have had a question about, you know, the Mongolian perception and the fact that the Mongols do not want to be perceived as destroyers, so now they have turned Marco Polo into a national myth. So what would you say about this mythical stature of Marco Polo today in Asia and in Europe?
Well, you know, it's easier for me to talk about the way he's seen in the West. I still think, no matter where I go and talk about Marco Polo, people are going to ask the same question that you did. Did he really go, and how do we know he really went? And, you know, it's a darn good question. And getting to the bottom of it, I think, really is helpful in understanding who he was. And, the mythical stature of Marco Polo, I think, is deceptive. It's like quicksand because it's so freighted with legends and inaccuracies. For example, bringing back pasta, just for starters. And yet the real story is so much more illuminating. In other words, the things that he really did bring back and why. But he's always going to be tantalizing because we're never going to know. He's, in a sense, a seminal figure like Shakespeare. We're never going to know enough about him to say, oh, yes, we have the full story. We know what he did every week of his life. We just aren't going to. We don't have the documents. And so that's intriguing and makes us work harder to fill in some of those gaps. It can also lead one astray, I suppose. But I think, it makes him a figure of fascination because, as I said, he's not the only person who wrote about his adventures, and yet he's the first one who comes to mind.
Well, thank you so much, Larry Bergreen, for your presentation and your discussion.
Thank you.